You never forget the moment you're made to feel like you don't belong. It happened to Will Smith on a quiet Thursday morning, not on a red carpet or movie set, but in a sleek Boston showroom surrounded by glass walls and polished chrome. What began as a simple errand to buy a car for someone he loved turned into something else entirely. A moment that would expose the quiet, persistent undercurrent of racial and class prejudice that still lingers, even in the most luxurious corners of America. The morning was crisp, early fall. Sunlight bounced off the showroom's marble floor and glinted off the hoods of million-dollar machines. Bentleys, Ferraris, Porsches, and one especially rare beauty, a midnight blue Azure coupe, parked dead center like a jewel in a glass case. The showroom itself, Boston Luxury Motors, was a fortress of wealth and prestige, where the scent of leather and engine oil was carefully masked by expensive cologne and practiced smiles. And into that world walked Will Smith. Not the red carpet Will, not the tuxedoed movie star. Today he was just Will, a man in jeans, sneakers, and a white cotton t-shirt. No entourage, no sunglasses, no spotlight, just a quiet determination and a plan in mind. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He was there because his cousin, more like a sister to him, had beaten cancer, and he wanted to celebrate her strength with something she'd always dreamed of, a luxury car. Something bold, something fast, something that said, "You made it." But that dream hit a wall the moment he walked in. From behind the showroom's concierge desk, a tall man in a tailored navy suit clocked Will immediately. Blake Thompson, the sales manager, prided himself on reading clients the second they stepped through the door. It was a skill he liked to brag about, knowing a serious buyer from a time waster based on shoes, posture, and the weight of a watch. Will's watch was a $60 Casio. His sneakers? Scuffed. His expression? Relaxed. Blake didn't see a globally recognized entertainer. He saw a black man in casual clothes, out of place among 300,000 toys. Will approached the nearest display vehicle, admiring its lines with a thoughtful look. Before he could even ask a question, Blake was on him, smiling yes, but with a gleam in his eye that spoke of quiet mockery. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone smooth but sharp. "This section's for appointments only. Our vehicles start at $300,000. You might be more comfortable checking out our used inventory down the street." Will blinked. For a moment he said nothing. Around him, two other staffers exchanged glances and subtle smirks. One even chuckled. A couple nearby glanced over, unsure whether to feel embarrassed or entertained. Will felt his stomach tighten, not from shame, but from something colder, familiar, something he hadn't tasted in a long time, but never truly forgot. He looked Blake in the eye. "I was actually interested in that Azure coupe," he said calmly, nodding toward the platform display. Blake's expression didn't change. If anything, his smile hardened. "That model is by appointment only," he said, his voice dipping into condescension, "and reserved for qualified buyers." Another polite way of saying, "Not you." Will could have name-dropped. He could have pulled out a platinum card or shown a bank transfer on his phone. But he didn't, because that wasn't the point. He glanced once more at the car, then back at Blake. "Got it," he said, quiet and even. Then with the weight of every moment like this that had come before it, in airports, stores, restaurants, he turned and walked out. No scene, no raised voice, just the sound of the glass door whispering shut behind him and the barely audible muttering from Blake. "Some people don't know their place." He would remember those words, but he wouldn't respond with anger. He had another way in mind. What the staff at Boston Luxury Motors didn't know, what they never even paused to wonder, was who they had just turned away. Will Smith wasn't some man off the street window shopping for cars he couldn't afford. He wasn't lost. He wasn't looking to waste anyone's time. He was, in fact, one of the most successful actors in the world, a household name with box office hits across decades. But beyond the fame and Hollywood spotlight, Will had built a quiet legacy rooted in compassion, supporting mental health initiatives, funding after-school programs, and most recently, launching a foundation focused on empowering youth in underserved communities. The man they brushed off so easily had poured millions into causes most of them couldn't name, let alone support. But Will didn't carry that resume on his chest. He didn't flaunt his wealth. That wasn't his way. He chose to live simply, not because he couldn't access luxury, but because he knew its trappings didn't define a person. He wore jeans because they were comfortable, a plain t-shirt because it was easy. He showed up without a fleet of handlers or flashy jewelry because he wanted to live in the real world, not above it. And he'd always believed that dignity wasn't something you could buy. It was how you carried yourself when no one thought you mattered. That day, he was on a personal mission. His cousin Monique, his closest family since childhood, had just completed her final round of chemo. It had been a brutal year. The hospital visits, the pain, the fear, but she had fought hard and she'd made it. And now Will wanted to celebrate her courage the best way he knew how, by surprising her with the car she dreamed of since college, a rare, handcrafted Azure coupe in deep midnight blue. He'd researched the model, called ahead to check availability, and even made a note of who carried it locally. That's what brought him to Boston Luxury Motors in the first place. It wasn't a random visit. It was planned, intentional, thoughtful. But none of that mattered the moment Blake Thompson looked him up and down and decided he wasn't worth the time. That was the part that stung, not because Will needed validation, but because it confirmed something he'd always known, but wished weren't true. No matter how much you achieve, how much you give, how much good you do, some people will always see only your skin and your sneakers. And yet Will didn't walk out of that dealership defeated. He walked out with clarity, because now the purchase wouldn't just be about Monique's birthday. It would be about something bigger, about showing the cost of assumptions, the price of prejudice, and the value of respect. Will didn't rush home that morning. He didn't call a lawyer, tweet about the incident, or go live on Instagram to call out the dealership. He didn't need to, because sometimes the strongest response is silence wrapped in self-control. He took a long walk through the city, hands in his pockets, letting the weight of the moment settle. The sting of what had happened wasn't new. He'd been feeling it since he was a teenager in Philly, trying to buy sneakers with his own money, only to be followed by security. The world had changed in many ways, but in others, it hadn't moved an inch. Even with global fame, even with wealth, respect could still be denied if you didn't look the part. But Will wasn't looking for revenge. What he wanted was understanding. He didn't want anyone fired. He didn't want to humiliate Blake Thompson the way Blake had tried to humiliate him. That would have been easy and meaningless. What Will sought was deeper. He wanted people like Blake to learn something they'd clearly never been taught, that dignity doesn't come from money, clothing, or social standing. It comes from character. Back at his home outside Boston, the gate quietly opened as Will's Rolls-Royce Phantom glided up the long, tree-lined driveway. His estate sat on several acres of land, elegant yet unpretentious, just like him. The front door opened before he even reached for the handle. His longtime assistant, Carla, stepped out with a knowing look. "You got that look again," she said gently. "What happened?" Will gave her a faint smile. "You ever walk into a place and realize the moment they see you, they've already decided who you are?" Carla sighed. "Too many times." He nodded. "Yeah, same." He recounted the story to her the way he had lived it, calm, detailed, with no bitterness in his voice, just truth. And as he spoke, something shifted, not in anger, in resolve. He walked to his study, sat down at the sleek walnut desk, and began making a few quiet calls, not to his publicist, not to a news outlet, but to his foundation team, his personal assistant, and his cousin Monique's favorite event planner. This wasn't just going to be a birthday gift. This was going to be a moment, a story, not one told with cameras or headlines, but with action, a demonstration of quiet power, of what it means to carry yourself with grace when others offer you none. Will knew one thing for sure. Letting that kind of behavior slide would mean allowing it to continue for the next person who walks in, wearing jeans and hope, and that he couldn't allow. The next morning, just after 10 a.m., a deep purr echoed through the parking lot of Boston Luxury Motors. Heads turned, conversations slowed. The valet outside stopped mid-motion as a custom Rolls-Royce Phantom, extended wheelbase, midnight black with silver detailing, glided to a perfect stop in front of the main entrance. It wasn't just the kind of car you noticed. It was the kind of car that made the world pause. The driver's door opened first. A uniformed chauffeur stepped out, white gloves pristine, posture crisp. He moved with deliberate grace around the vehicle and opened the rear passenger door with a fluid motion practiced to perfection. From inside, Will Smith stepped out. Not the Will in sneakers and a t-shirt from the day before, but Will in a custom-fitted charcoal gray suit, crisp white shirt, and subtle black tie. His shoes shined like mirrors. His cufflinks caught the morning sun. The man who had been treated like a trespasser 24 hours earlier now stood at the entrance like he owned the entire block. Inside the showroom, Blake Thompson caught sight of the vehicle through the glass panels. His breath caught, pulse quickened. Even in a building full of six-figure cars, a custom Phantom stood apart, and the man stepping out. He looked vaguely familiar. Blake straightened his tie and smoothed his suit jacket. Big spenders often arrived unannounced. This was his moment. He strode across the showroom, plastering on his most charming smile. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors," he said as he reached the front doors. "Blake Thompson, sales manager. It's an absolute pleasure to—" Will turned to face him, eyes calm but sharp. "I believe we've met." Blake blinked, unsure. I'm not sure. "You met me yesterday," Will said evenly, "when I was wearing jeans and a t-shirt." The words hit like a brick. Blake's expression shifted. Recognition, then confusion, then panic. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Will didn't need to elaborate. The Rolls-Royce had already spoken for him. So had the tailored suit, the driver, the silence now falling over every employee within earshot. "I was interested in the Azure Coupe," Will continued, voice firm but never raised. "But I was told it was for appointment-only clients. Then I watched you show it to someone else without an appointment." Blake struggled to recover, gesturing toward the showroom. "Mr. Smith, there must have been a misunderstanding." Will's eyebrow rose slightly. "Was there?" From across the floor, the dealership owner, Richard Mason, had stepped out of his office, drawn by the sudden commotion. He stopped in his tracks when he saw who was standing in his showroom. Will turned his gaze to him. "Mr. Mason, perhaps we should have a conversation, because what happened here yesterday wasn't just bad service. It was something far worse, and I think you know exactly what I mean." The silence inside Boston Luxury Motors was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every employee, every early customer, and even Richard Mason himself stood frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Blake Thompson, once the confident face of the dealership, now looked like a man unraveling thread by thread. Will didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His presence alone, and the truth of what he represented, spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. "I came here yesterday to buy a gift," Will said calmly, eyes moving from Blake to Richard. "A rare Azure Coupe for someone who means the world to me. I was ready to pay cash. I had plans to place a corporate order as well, 6 or 7 vehicles for a foundation I run. But because I wasn't dressed the part, because I didn't look the way you thought I should, I was treated like I didn't belong." Richard swallowed hard, face flushing with embarrassment. "Mr. Smith, I assure you, this isn't how we conduct business. I had no idea." "But Blake did," Will interrupted gently. "He made it very clear what kind of customer you value and what kind you don't." A murmur moved through the crowd. Blake glanced around, searching for support and finding none. "Yesterday was personal," Will continued, "but this is about something bigger. This is about every person who walks into a place like this and is told with a smile that they're not good enough, that they need to prove themselves just to be acknowledged." He turned to Daniel, the young salesman who had quietly tried to help the day before. "You treated me with respect, even when you didn't know who I was, and that mattered. So here's what we're going to do." Will paused. The room leaned in. "I'm still buying the Azure Coupe for my cousin, but Daniel will handle the sale, start to finish." Daniel's eyes widened. "Me? Yes, sir. Absolutely." Will nodded, then looked back at Richard Mason. As for the rest of my intended purchases, my corporate fleet, the donations tied to those deals, that business will go elsewhere. Somewhere the customer is seen before they're judged. Richard's face dropped. Losing one luxury car sale was unfortunate. Losing a fleet, a foundation partnership, it was a gut punch that would echo all the way to quarterly reviews. Will turned once more to Blake. And as for you, I'm not asking for your job. I'm asking for something harder. I want you to volunteer. My foundation has a youth program that works with kids with physical and mental disabilities. You'll spend a few weeks assisting, listening, learning. No suits, no sales floor. Just people. Real ones. Blake opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in years, he felt what it meant to be truly humbled. Will offered no smirk, no satisfaction. Only a steady look that said, "This is how we grow, when we're willing to look at what we've refused to see." At first, Blake Thompson showed up to the foundation out of obligation, not conviction. His pride was still smarting, and every fiber of his ego resisted the idea that he needed to be taught a lesson. He told himself it was just temporary, a few weeks of damage control, so the dealership could save face and possibly repair the relationship with Will Smith. But the moment he stepped into the brightly lit gym of the Foundation's youth center, something shifted. There were no suits here, no luxury branding, just kids, some in wheelchairs, some using walkers, others with visible scars and missing limbs, each one beaming with determination and resilience. The energy was raw, genuine, and completely disarming. Blake was assigned to help set up for the Foundation's weekly adaptive sports clinic. His first task? Assist an 11-year-old named Thomas with strapping into his basketball wheelchair. The boy was quick-witted, sharp-tongued, and had no patience for people who didn't know what they were doing. "Loosen that strap, coach," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "You're cutting off my circulation." Blake blinked. "Sorry, I'm new at this." "No kidding," Thomas smirked, then added, "It's cool. You'll get better." It was the first time in years someone had spoken to Blake without deference, expectation, or pretense. Just truth. Over the following days, Blake kept showing up, quietly at first, then with more engagement. He fetched water bottles, chased stray balls, helped kids navigate ramps, and listened, really listened, to the stories of these young warriors who faced challenges every single day, far greater than a bruised ego or a lost commission. He learned about resilience from Jasmine, who was paralyzed in a car accident but now raced in marathons with her custom hand cycle. He learned about patience from Isaiah, who communicated through a digital voice device and taught Blake how to play adaptive ping pong. And he learned about dignity from Thomas, who, despite needing help for everything from eating to dressing, carried himself like a general on a mission. By the end of the second week, something in Blake had shifted. The man who once judged worth by wristwatches and wardrobes now found himself evaluating people by how they treated others when there was nothing to gain. He even began mentoring Daniel back at the dealership, offering genuine support and guidance without competition. It surprised everyone, including himself. At night he reflected, not with regret, but with gratitude. What started as a punishment had become a mirror, and for the first time in a long time, Blake Thompson liked the man he saw looking back. He was beginning to understand what Will meant when he said, "Some lessons cost more than money, but they're worth every penny." A month later, the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza in Boston shimmered with soft gold lighting and polished marble floors. It was the annual benefit gala for the Will Smith Foundation, and the air was alive with music, laughter, and something deeper: purpose. The room was filled with donors, doctors, community leaders, and the very children and families whose lives had been forever changed by the Foundation's work. Near the entrance, wearing a crisp event staff polo instead of his usual designer suit, stood Blake Thompson. He greeted guests, held open doors, and helped guide wheelchair users toward their tables. His posture was humbler, movements more deliberate. No flash, no arrogance, just presence. Across the room, Will Smith stood with his arm around his cousin Monique, who looked radiant in a royal blue gown. Her smile said everything. The Azure coupe, now parked safely at her home, had been the surprise of a lifetime. But tonight, this celebration wasn't about cars or grand gestures. It was about community, healing, and growth. As Blake made his way through the room, he noticed Thomas waving from across the floor, his little arm flailing from his wheelchair. "You made it, Mr. Blake!" the boy shouted, grinning from ear to ear. Blake crouched beside him. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, coach." Thomas nodded seriously. "You got better at pushing ramps." Blake chuckled. "Well, I had a good teacher." Not long after, Will approached, calm, composed, and every bit the man who had orchestrated not just a correction, but a transformation. He extended a hand. "Blake," he said with a nod. Blake stood. "Mr. Smith, I wanted to say again, I'm sorry. But more than that, I'm grateful. I didn't think I needed to learn anything. I was wrong." Will looked him over for a moment. "The thing about respect," he said, "is that it should never be based on clothes, color, or cash. It should be your default until someone proves they don't deserve it, not the other way around." Blake nodded slowly. "That's a lesson I won't forget." Will smiled and added, "Daniel tells me you've been mentoring him at the dealership." "He's sharp," Blake replied. "Way sharper than I gave him credit for. I've been working with Mr. Mason, too. We're putting together a training program on bias, customer dignity, that kind of thing." Will paused, impressed. "That fleet order I put on hold. Maybe we revisit it. You think you can handle that?" Blake's eyes widened, not in excitement, but in genuine appreciation. "Yes, sir, and I'll make sure it's done right." Later that evening, as Will and Monique worked the room, Blake found himself off to the side, watching not as a salesman, but as someone who had been changed from the inside out. He finally understood. Wealth wasn't what you wore or drove, it was how you treated others, especially when no one was watching. As the final notes of the gala string quartet faded into the night, something lingered in the air. Something far more powerful than music or applause. It was a feeling, a shift. The kind that doesn't come from headlines or social media posts, but from real human connection, from humility, from growth. Blake Thompson had come to that ballroom as a changed man. Not because someone forced him to apologize, but because someone gave him the space to see himself clearly and the opportunity to do better. And he took it. Will Smith didn't need to prove anything that day at the dealership. He had the money, the fame, the influence, but he knew that none of those things meant anything if they weren't used to elevate others, to teach without humiliation, to correct without crushing. And maybe that's the true mark of power, not dominance, but discipline, not calling someone out, but calling them up. This wasn't just a story about a car or a rude salesman. It was a story about the assumptions we make, the damage they cause, and the people brave enough to challenge them with grace. Because the truth is, we all make judgments, consciously or not. We size people up based on clothes, accents, skin color, or posture. But what happens when we slow down long enough to question those assumptions? When we ask ourselves, what if I'm wrong? What if this person is more than I think? That's where change begins. Will didn't humiliate the people who misjudged him. He didn't go viral. He didn't raise his voice. He simply let the truth speak for itself, quiet, steady, undeniable. And in doing so, he gave everyone in that showroom, and now everyone hearing this story, a lasting reminder. Respect isn't earned by appearance. It's proven by character. True wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in how you treat people when no one important is watching. So the next time someone walks into your space, looking different, dressing simply, speaking softly, pause before you judge, because beneath the surface might be a story, a lesson, or a legend in disguise. And that perhaps is the real luxury.